South of the border, there are protesters calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Repeatedly interrupted testimony from Secretary of State Antony Blinken before the Senate. Blinken was there to provide support for President Joe Biden's request for $106 billion to fund plans for Ukraine, Israel, and U.S. border security. With more on this and the relationship between our two countries in this time of war, I'm joined now by U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen. Ambassador Cohen, pleasure to welcome you back. Thank you for making the time.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here.
You spoke today to a Canadian audience about this relationship, particularly in this time of insecurity. And I wanted to ask you about a couple aspects of what you said. First off, you did say that a two-state solution is the only structure that we know of to create a lasting peace that allows the Palestinian people and the Israeli people to coexist and to survive and to move forward. Do you still think a two-state solution is viable?
I do think it is viable. More importantly, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, both think it is viable, and it's really the only solution. And there's slightly more context to that. We cannot go on and continue to go on to have outbreaks like we've had. You start with the terrorist attack by Hamas, which is just no excuse. Terrorism is never okay, particularly terrorism that targets civilians and children and babies. And by the same token, though, we stand strong for Israel's right to defend itself and to defend its future. But you can't have an in perpetuity tension like we have in the Mideast. The notion of a two-state solution is not new in the last 2 weeks with this outbreak. It has been around for a long time, and the President has said, Secretary of State has said, I agree that the only enduring solution is a two-state solution, which has to be negotiated.
I guess the reason why I asked about the viability of it is because of what's occurred since October 7th and the degree to which that might impact what is already lower levels of support among the two parties for that kind of a solution. Are you concerned about that?
Well, look, I don't think a two-state solution is possible in the next 2 weeks. I mean, there's no doubt that the tension that has been created by this terrorist act and now Israel's reaction to that is going to take a while to be able to get back to the table and talk about a long-term solution. But if you're focusing on the long term, there just is no solution other than a two-state solution.
I spoke to, I know President Biden had made some comments recently that alluded to mistakes the U.S. has made in the wake of terrorist attacks and how you kind of got to move forward lessons learned and heed that. I spoke to General David Petraeus over the weekend, who, of course, led the U.S. forces in the surge in Iraq and led U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And he talked in that vein about the significance of Israel talking more publicly about what the next phase will look like after Hamas, for example, is eradicated, after the sort of imminent situation that they face right now. Do you agree that it would be good policy to talk more publicly about that?
So you know me, I try and respect my lane. And I'm not sure it's my lane to provide advice to Israel about how Israel should talk about the future and should talk about the tactics that it is going to deploy. I've noticed that recently Mr. Netanyahu has talked about this as another war of independence. And I think in many ways this is another war of survival. That is the world in which Israel functions. And President and Secretary of State have laid down a very clear parameter. That is that Israel has the absolute right to defend itself and to take actions to ensure that this does not happen again. By the same token, Israel must go out of its way to respect civilian life, and that you cannot respond to a terrorist act that targeted and slaughtered civilians and children by turning around and doing the same thing. And I think that the way the president has characterized it is perfect, which is Israel has the absolute right to defend itself, prevent this from happening again within norms of international law. And I don't think we can or should put Israel to the test of announcing up front what they're going to do and what the post beating back of Hamas is going to look like.
I guess the reason I ask is, as opposed to, for example, the war with Russia and Ukraine, which the West has really solidified around, particularly, let's say, in the relationship between the U.S. and Canada. In Canada, there is a lot of domestic pressure on the federal government to take a policy view that deviates from the one they are now, which is very closely aligned to the U.S. And I guess I think it's against that backdrop that I'm asking, what would be helpful in order to maintain the coalition that has been built and in order to sort of buoy the support for the U.S. position so far?
So, as unhappy as I am to say this and to acknowledge this, there's plenty of disagreement in the United States, too.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
And this is, to mix religions, this is a cross that Israel has had to bear. It is for its entire existence. It's been subjected to a double standard about its conduct versus the conduct of terrorists who have attacked the country. And it's one of the reasons I'm so proud and grateful that Joe Biden is president of the United States, because he knows what's right. He's had a consistent position for his entire career. He has articulated his position from the very beginning of this horrendous and illegal terrorist attack on Israel. And he has been consistent and held to that. And I think that's what he's going to continue to do.
The director of the FBI today actually said that the threat that Hamas poses to the U.S. is the greatest one, in his assessment, potentially since ISIS. I remember those years very clearly in both our countries, and in particular the kind of feeling of that threat for a number of years. Yep. Do you think that's what we're in for?
Well, I didn't hear the FBI director's statement, and I don't know that I know enough to be able to say that one way or another, but I will say that I just don't think there's any doubt that the Mideast situation is the most complicated, most dangerous tinderbox that is pending in the world today. I think, unfortunately, that there are many other times in history where you could say the same thing. I mean, it's just a very dangerous situation, a very dangerous environment, which is why I think it is so important for the president and for the United States to be crystal clear about its expectations and the support that it has for Israel to defend itself and to react in a way consistent with international law.
Your time is limited, so I have one final question that is more political in nature about the relationship.
Your time is limited,
well,
too.
Well, both of ours, yeah. It's actually just about, today you had spoken about Canada and the U.S. essentially leading a coalition of nations, I think is how you phrased it, in support of Ukraine and now Israel. The chief of defense staff in this country is now talking about having to cut $1 billion from the defense budget. In your view, does that detract from Canada's seat at the table, at the coalition, in those conversations?
So there are lots of characterizations about what the Defense Department may or may not be asked to do. And I mean, there has been discussion of a need to cut $900 million. You can round that to $1 billion if you want, out of the defense budget. On the other hand, there have been comments by the Minister of Defense that those cuts are not necessarily programmatic, that those are cuts that might be able to be achieved without cutting program. And then you have the foreign minister gave a far-reaching foreign policy speech yesterday, who said that we can all expect, Canadians and United States and allies, that we can expect increased defense spending once the defense policy review is completed. So criticize me from looking at the glass as half full, but I'm going to take Canada at its words. That it's expressed to me, which is a recognition that defense preparedness, particularly continental defense preparedness, is a critical priority. I think Ukraine and situation in Israel only reinforce the need for the world's democracies to spend money on defense. None of this is free. You're going to have to do that. And I see the NORAD modernization plan, the Indo-Pacific strategy, all of which involve additional defense spending. Most of it's not budgeted yet, but I'm prepared to wait for the completion of the defense policy review and to be satisfied with the way in which Canada has stepped up to provide additional support for Ukraine, has stepped up with an aggressive NORAD modernization strategy and a very strong Indo-Pacific strategy as well, and to give them the room to execute on those strategies.
So I read from that you're not worried yet.
I will say I'm not worried yet.
Okay, Ambassador, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it as always.
Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David